When you read books or watch movies like Lord of the Rings or Ender's Game, there's an imaginary world involved. It could include aliens or superpowers or take place in the future.
It's a world that's very different and yet at the same time very similar to our own. Creating and constructing how it all works is called world building, which is what we're going to explore today. Our guest is science fiction writer Mary Fan. Mary is the author of the Jane Colt series. Mary, thanks so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
You know, I know that science fiction and fantasy authors can talk about world building for days, so we're going to try to do a quick version here. How does the writer start?
Well, you want to start with what you really want your reader to get out of this book. Like whether it's an issue you want to explore, for example, I don't know, bioengineering or artificial intelligence. You want to start with that topic and build your world around that.
Okay.
And then what about, could you explain a little bit more about what you want the book to be about?
Well, the thing about science fiction is that it's usually tied to some issue that does affect our everyday lives. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's technology, sometimes it's a bioethics question. And so you really want to explore how this would impact your characters, because ultimately that's what the reader is going to care about, is the people involved in the story, and then the plot kind of gets shaped around that.
Okay. So science fiction has this sort of perception of being infinite. It's limitless. Mm-hmm. Is there a way that the author can kind of grasp all of that and make it manageable?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to focus in on your characters, because the thing about science fiction is, like you said, it's limitless. You can explore worlds and go on about it forever. However, your story has to focus in on a few particular people, because that's what your reader's going to care about. They're going to want to follow one protagonist, or maybe two or three, but a small group of their favorites on a journey.
It sounds like sometimes that small group can represent so many infinite other possibilities.
Exactly. They're going to represent, a point of view. They're going to represent, a particular aspect of the culture you're building.
Okay.
Well, how deep do you have to go, or should you go, in terms of creating this world for your writers?
Well, there's really two levels of depth. There's the level for yourself as the writer, and then there's the level you portray in your book. And for yourself as a writer, you want to go a lot deeper than what might ultimately end up in the manuscript. You want to know, where this world came from. You want to know the history. You want to know how it's all connected, because that's going to affect your plot in ways that you might not realize, and it's going to help make your world more believable. But you don't want to jam that all into your story, because you don't want to get bogged down in these kinds of descriptions and exposition when really your reader wants to know what happens.
So it helps you as the writer to create that a little bit better for the reader, but they don't necessarily need all of these little details.
Exactly.
Minute details.
Yes.
Okay.
World building is a lot like it's like an iceberg. You have all these supporting documents. You have practically an encyclopedia, on your own computer. But the reader's only going to get that tip, and yet without everything else, that tip's not going to exist.
It won't work.
Yeah.
It won't work if you don't have the base.
So in the process of building this world, what kinds of common errors do you see other writers making? What can they try to avoid?
The biggest error I see is not being consistent within your own world. Because the thing is, readers will hone in on that. They're a lot smarter than a lot of writers give them credit for. And so if you set a rule for yourself and then you break it later, it's going to take people out of the world and into a place you don't want them to go.
Yeah, and then you've lost them as readers. They don't trust you anymore. Yeah, I can see that could be a very big problem.
Yeah, although setting those rules in the first place, it's also very important.
Okay.
Because the last thing you want is some sort of boundless, amorphous world that doesn't make any sense. And so setting these limits for yourself helps keep it all contained, helps give it structure and shape.
Okay.
What surprises you about writing this world, this fictional world? What surprises you about it?
Well, the thing about writing is no matter how much you outline and, come up with backstories and whatnot, you're always going to have surprises along the way. Like, you could be halfway through your manuscript and suddenly realize you never explored this one aspect that you want to bring up. And so you really have to just, that's okay. You just have to be prepared for that.
I've heard that some good writers can become great writers depending on a number of different things. And I have heard that world building, the idea of creating this imaginary world ahead of time, can be the difference between a good story and a great one. Do you agree with that? Do you think there's any relevance to that?
Oh yeah, I definitely agree. Because a lot of the great sci-fi and fantasy books you think of, it's really the world, it has a life of its own. Like you mentioned Lord of the Rings, you could just think about yourself being there. It's really a vast universe, and the story you read in Lord of the Rings is just a piece of it.
Mm-hmm. So many other fantasy stories have built upon that one, so it's obviously one of the best that's ever been out there.
Yep, exactly. And what I think makes a great sci-fi or fantasy world is one that feels lived in, where you feel like, the story you have at hand, the story your characters are following, is just a part of something that's a lot bigger.
Okay.
One of the last questions we wanted to ask you is, how does a writer get all of this information to create this story that they're in, this world? How do they create this world and make it believable?
Well, the thing about sci-fi and fantasy that's so great is that it's all about what if. And so you can actually get a lot of inspiration from just the world around you. Like, you can look at the way things are and think, well, what if they were somehow different? Another thing is to just read a lot about the rest of the world. I find a lot of inspiration from like the science sections of newspapers, for example, because they'll talk about cutting-edge technologies and new experiments, and then you start thinking about, well, what would happen if that came true? And so that's a good thing.
And then sort of how you can start to build and create this other world that doesn't really exist, and it will inspire you.
Exactly, exactly.
And I know there have been a few examples in real life where a science fiction author invented something and later it actually became real. So that can be really exciting to think that you might write something that one day will actually take place.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Keeping that in the back of your mind.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming in.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This has been great. I think that people have a lot of basis to now start and create their own world.
Create their own world.
For the next
Hopefully.
one.